we're going to close this series of lectures for today by turning to France in the early 1900s, especially the 1920s and 30s. Now, take a second and think about what's happened if we jump to the 20s between 1910 and 1920. We've had World War I, known as the War to End All Wars. 1914 to 1918 are the dates of U.S. involvement in that war. This war was devastating. I think it's difficult for us because we exist in a time when there's always war somewhere. But think about this. Whole villages throughout Europe, doesn't matter what country, ended up with their population of young men totally gone. This was essentially a trench war fought especially in the fields of France and somewhat in the fields of Germany, where you would dig in for months at a time. And so you had the horror of being sort of locked into this, digging in trenches. So you're living semi-underground in muddy, cold, horrible conditions. This war saw the advent, especially, wasn't the first time it was used, but a lot of use of chemical warfare, mustard gas. So men who are not just being heroically shot, but who are being gassed and coughing up bits of lung and things like that. We see airplanes used as a weapon, artillery, all kinds of things. And there's this image of the war is fought from not the generals on the front lines, but from the generals sitting back in the cities, commanding the little pawns. If you want an impetus to say, look how dehumanized society is becoming, this war would be one way to do it. So in one sense, this is the disillusionment of Europe, and to a certain extent the United States, who, as I say, between the wars go through a period of isolationism. Teddy Roosevelt early in the 20th century, we're gonna sort of do what we need to do, and then the U.S. gets into World War I, but then withdraws from that. So we have this whole, what they call the lost generation, this hopeful, optimistic young men especially, who were going to go out and fight the war, for example, on the side of the allies of England and France and the USA, and it's gonna be great. And if people thought this war would take just months, just a little trouble over there in France, and instead we have whole villages who are reduced to the very old and the very young and women, no men, because they're all killed. Whole villages nowadays, I don't think you can do it, but whole villages would enlist together and be a regiment all together, and the whole regiment's wiped out. There you go. That's why they don't anymore let siblings sign up for the same combat unit, I think. I'm pretty sure that's true. So on the one hand, there's this great disillusionment. After World War I, there is also an economic boom. It is often the case, although I guess not always, that war for the winners tends to mean big business. Industry starts humming and things pick up. So in the 20s, we have the roaring 20s. Stock markets rise, industrialization continues, the techniques and advances that were created as war technology turn into peacetime technology. And we see this sort of flowering of a new society, an easier going society in the 20s. And in a lot of ways, the old morals that held us before have broken down in the face of World War I's horror. If you let me take it to sort of an extreme, but it's actually a true thread. Women's clothing in the 1920s slims down. You have a lot fewer undergarments than you did in 1900. Hemlines rise, necklines drop. The silhouettes for women become really straight and almost boyish. You can in fact, see-through clothing is I mean, not totally transparent, but the idea that you could actually get a sense of a woman's actual natural shape beneath her clothes was pretty novel. Clothing for men, by contrast, becomes more exaggerated, more fantastical. The zoot suit with its wide shoulders and its wide big cuffs and the sort of the stripe and everything, that is a thing. There is a certain amount of sexual liberation In fact, the word jazz has a sort of, we don't know exactly how the word evolved, but one of the connotations is sort of petting, illicit sex, sort of just necking, and this idea that now you didn't need a chaperone, or you could daringly not have a chaperone, and you could hang out in parties, cocktail parties, and men and women together. I mean, this seems very normal to us watching, I don't know, old movies from the 30s and 40s, but this was really a turn away from Victorian and late Romantic society, which was filled with social rules. So the music of the time has the same sort of turnaround in some ways. And so we're going to follow this thread from France. In order to follow the thread, we've got to just have a nod here to say that what was happening in American popular music from the 1900s to 1920s is the rise of jazz. As your book says, and as I say, this unfortunately is not a course about the history of jazz. You need to take Dr. Whalen's course and do that if you can. But we see the rise of several popular music styles coming from ragtime, from blues, and this fuses in some ways into New Orleans style jazz. So the American South finally has its own indigenous American music that is neither African or European, but it's sort of created from this melting pot, if you will, of styles. The social dancing of the time reflects this really rhythmic base to this jazz style. It's intensely rhythmic. At the same time, as you know, it's intensely improvisatory. This goes back to the blues structure, which was originally a call and response, improvised structure. We have the blues scale, which is not a totally functional major scale, nor is it a totally functional minor scale. It's got elements of major and minor. It's got notes that are not actually perfectly in tune. They're a little bit this, they're a little bit that. So in some ways, jazz appeals greatly to those composers in Europe who were infatuated with Impressionism or Post-Impressionism because it's doing some of the same things. But as we're going to see, the jazz influence has other attractions as well to the new generation of composers in the 1920s. One other appeal of jazz, and it spread to Europe relatively rapidly because Americans were in Europe fighting the war, and so you bring your music with you. And then after the war, with travel being easier to get back and forth across the ocean, especially French musicians go over and listen to Harlem nightclubs to listen to jazz. Americans move to Paris and stay there. Josephine Baker, for example, your book mentions her, is a famous cabaret singer. She's African American. She goes over and is a huge hit at the Folies Bergère at I can't remember the other theater. Opens her own nightclub and eventually becomes a French citizen. She in a place, and think about this. She's a French citizen and owns her own nightclub and is a celebrity, where in her country of origin in the United States, she's not allowed to go in the front door. So it's just fascinating. Okay, I don't have time to go into all that. Or I should, but I don't. So we have jazz has now been introduced to Europe, and the Europeans are being introduced to jazz back in the United States. Okay. The appeal of jazz was partly its sort of free exuberance, its freedom from old rules. Just like people were saying, this old society is what got us into this world war in the first place, this war to end all wars. And people really thought they'd never have another war like that. This was it. We worked it out. We're done. And now we can just be free and easy. It also was appealing because it was not Germanic. And post-World War I, there's strong anti-German sentiment because it was their fault they caused this war. I think history could say that Germany was the aggressor in World War I, along with, allies of Germany. So that's partly the appeal. What else then? Let's look just at musicians, composers of this time. Remember primitivism. What's the appeal of jazz to composers who may have watched primitivism develop, or post-impressionist composers? Jazz, with its strong rhythmic underlayment and its improvisatory upper layers, melodic and harmonic layers, seems to parallel what is sought after in primitivism. Let's go back to pre-civilized stuff, because civilization produced this war. Everything's horrible. Let's get back to that. Let's go back. However, unlike the primitivists who were kind of after a soulless kind of thing, this was a more nostalgic use of it. Jazz, one term for jazz music in this era is jungle music, because this was seen as the primal rhythm of Africa being filtered through this modern medium, and somehow it's both exotic and it's more sophisticated and acceptable. One composer that hears this in Harlem is the French composer Darius Milhaud, Milhoud. Milhaud, say it. Milhaud, thank you. 1892 to 1974 is when he lived. He heard this jazz music in Harlem, and your book gives a little excerpt about how moved he was, and he talks about this sort of primal rhythm, or this music coming from the dawn of time. And so one of the things that he does is he writes a ballet called La Création du Monde, the creation of the world. La Création du Monde. This ballet essentially has a jazz band in it. Of course, he's a French art composer trying to write jazz, or using jazz. This is not it's not like an Ellington swing ballet or something like that. It's actually less sophisticated than actual jazz of the time. But he's trying. He constructs what he calls a sort of a Negro legend. The voice, the storytelling of the dawn of the world from primal Africa. And so we have the appeal of exoticism, but as I say, there is, I think, a certain thread of that primitivist sort of thing. However, this primitivist picture of the dawn of time is not full of heavy jumping and hypnotic sacrifice and things like that. It's full of le jazz hot. It's full of hot jazz. It's really kind of a hybrid piece. This piece is not a serious piece. He wasn't trying to be a serious jazz composer, nor was he trying to be a serious expressionist or primitivist. But he's also not trying to be ironic or satirical. And sometimes for these French composers, satire is a huge element. This is just kind of like, isn't this cool? Let's imagine the dawn of time. So what you're going to hear is you're going to hear... I guess you could say it's a combination of Rite of Spring and Dixieland jazz. We've got lots of dominant seventh oriented progressions. So we do have functional harmony. We have, and those progressions are presented as harmonic blocks in that primitivist chunky style. We have rhythmic syncopation. We have wind instruments that are scored to sound primitive. The wailing of the woodwinds, like calls from the ancient forest. And we have, we're going to have a conglomeration, a piling of fragments that are pentatonic and octatonic. So we're going to have polyrhythms that pile up pentatonic and octatonic scale fragments. All of these things, bits and pieces of impressionism, bits and pieces of jazz, bits and pieces of primitivism, but it's saying something else. It's a collage, which was a very trendy art form in the 1920s. Pile things together and don't worry about interpreting it for your listeners or your viewers. Just let it there and they will look at it and say, ooh, that's cool. I recognize those bits. That's kind of a cool way they work together. So that's Mio to a certain extent. Mio and his buddies have more to say. He has buddies. He has 5 of them. We're going to talk about a group called Les Six, the 6. Six, S-I-X, looks like 6. Yeah, Les Six, the 6. He and other artists, not just musicians, wished to turn away from that complex, super serious, hyper-romantic stuff. Where everything meant something and you were on a quest. They turned away from that. Again, notice we're turning away. They first turned to the symbolism and impressionism to say, well, let's be objective. What is the impression of light on my eyes? What are the impressions of my senses? But even there, they found that was not clean enough. Satie, on the one hand, sought for simplicité et clarté, simplicity and clarity. Let's make melodies even more simple. Let's make everything totally apparent or transparent. In a way, Satie's point of view is like he's anti-art music. Let's not be too fancy here. Now, let's not get back to our primitive animal roots, but let's strip everything down and just let's make it simple. Music then becomes for Satie not quite music. This is music, but it isn't music. Like the painting I'm going to put up here on the screen for you of René Magritte's picture of a pipe, but the inscription on the painting says, "Ceci n'est pas d'une pipe." This is not a pipe. Isn't it? Is it not a pipe? Actually, it's a picture of a pipe. So no, it isn't a pipe. This is music that is not music. But wait, I'm listening to it. Isn't it music? No, this is music to not be listened to, like the wallpaper music, for example. Satie wants to have this sort of cool distance. Eventually, I'll tell you in just a second. If you distance yourself enough from it and make it simple enough, it becomes absurd. If it becomes absurd enough, it's all meaningless. Post-World War I, meaninglessness is okay. Because you know what? The war is here. Life is horrible. We're all going to die anyway. So instead of screaming with expressionist pain, we just say, oh well, fine. And be silly in a sort of, I don't know, the best I can think of is a sort of Pee Wee Herman kind of way. We're going to be outrageous for the sake of being outrageous because nothing really actually matters. So Satie and his students, the students of Satie are the ones known as Les Six. They start filling their music not with a chain of signifiers that mean Tristan chord, desire, resolve it, that all connect, but they start filling their music with signifiers that don't apparently connect. Let's use the Tristan chord, but it's not going to resolve to anything. We're not talking about that. Why did you use it? This sort of weird stuff that seems important and yet we think it must have a connection, but I can't connect it. This is surrealism. The painter movement, the surrealists, are friends with these guys. And they work, in fact, on films. Take it to its extreme and let's be outrageous and silly and pointless just to be outrageous and silly. And you've got the movement Dada, where René Magritte, again, famously, I think it was Magritte, took a urinal and labeled it, signed it as an artwork and gave it to a museum and said, "This is my artwork, you must display it." Well, it's a piss pot. I mean, what? But now it's in a museum. It's art because we say it's art. He's thumbing, but he's saying, well, but this is also something people pee in. It's not the beauty of, look at the beauty of the innate object. It's, I dare you to put this in a museum because I said it's worth something. It's art. So now you have to put it in. It's that kind of thumb your nose at society. let's see here. Les Six. Who are the composers in Les Six? These French composers. And we'll talk a little bit about what they do, because our next two pieces are by these guys. 6 composers, of which you may only recognize 2 names at this point, and probably 3, hopefully, by the time you take your next exam. Les Six. Poulenc, Mio, Auric, Honegger, a woman, Taillefer, and Dury. We don't ever hear about Dury. Taillefer, your book remarks that her career sort of came to a catastrophic end because of marriage and children. So much for that. Honegger, we're going to listen to the one piece that he's still famous for. Auric, I don't think we really know much in this country, but the other 2, okay. So let me move from Mio and Satie on to Poulenc. Post-World War I, Surrealism is popular, as I say, because of its sort of slick non-reality. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die kind of thing. That's one response to a war to end all wars. Poulenc's musical style starts off in this very careless, almost satirical vein. But by the time we listen to the sextet, this is from the 1930s, his style has matured a little bit. I mean, okay, these young musicians grow up a little bit and they have to pay the bills. And I'm not saying they're writing music that pays bills, but they get a little more mature and their point of view changes a little. So Poulenc, if you listen to the first movement of the sextet for winds and piano, the style is, his melodic style is extremely simple. These are simple, singable, short melodies. They're almost too easy to sing. They're the kind that get stuck in your head. This is terrible, ask Dr. Palmer or Dr. Murray or Professor Dodd to sing the trio, any of the trio, the brass trio by Poulenc. And they will probably groan because they will be stuck singing it, even if you just mention it to them. I'm consciously trying to not think of it myself right now. It's the kind of stuff that gets stuck in your head because it's so banal. It's so simple, and it fits the ideal simple melody stereotype so well that you can't get it out of your head. His other features of his music are, again, ostinato. They learned this lesson from the Impressionists well. The ostinato here is used as almost a white noise. It just exists, and it exists, and it exists to an extent that it's almost annoying. Instead of saying, ooh, let's listen to the cool coincidence of melody versus ostinato, we say, God, when will that stop? And in a sense, we stop listening because it's the same thing over and over. Like you listening to this video. You're probably not listening. Some of you, I can tell. Even from here, I can tell. So we have ostinato that are meant to be almost not listened to. We have super simple melodies. Harmonies are looser, functional, they're tonal. But when I say looser, I mean we've added higher tertians. And we have a more careless approach to dissonance, preparation, resolution. That is the aftermath of Impressionism. This first movement has thematic unity. It is in a sort of a loose sonata form, ternary-ish form. But there is no underlying drive. When was the last time we had a sonata form that was not some kind of hero quest? That wasn't an urge to get us from dominant to tonic. Yay. This is really pretty cool about it. It's like, oh yeah, well, as long as we're here, we might as well do a sonata form. It's neither formally strict nor full of urgent narrative. It's just cooler and calmer. By the way, also, we are back to absolute music here. This is not depicting anything. But this isn't necessarily music to listen to. This is not as extreme as Satie's wallpaper music. This is more to be listened to, but don't work at it too hard. Don't break a sweat here. Just, yeah, it's nice. It's good. Also, by the way, I think there is a thread here to think about woodwind players. You may note that there is this fascination with the vivid tone colors of woodwind instruments that will persist through the 20th century in all the chamber music and solo repertoire and orchestral repertoire. This fascination with tone color seems to me specifically French. Okay, one more piece from Les Six, Honegger. His piece Pacific 231, which is 1923. This piece, Pacific 231, depicts, as we think, as everybody thinks, a locomotive, a steam engine. That was how trains went. And by the way, everybody rode trains in those days. That's the way you got around. Trains, planes, and automobiles. Okay, so think train, totally normal mode of transportation. Steam engine, the diesel is just about to come in the 1920s, but this sort of, full of steam, pieces moving, great wheels turning, camshafts, everything connecting. It's pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, Honegger denied that this piece was about it's not about a specific train. Let's write a piece depicting the Hogwarts Express. It's not about a specific train. But in fact, let's take it a step further. Just like Magritte's painting, Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. This is not a train. Isn't it? Well, no, it's a piece of music about a train. Is it? Not exactly. It's a piece of music representing the work that a machine does, and it happens to sound a heck of a lot like a train. He gives it a title that suggests, that's how they named trains. Pacific, whatever. Anyway, trust me, that's how they name trains. He is toying with a programmatic title, but he's not totally comfortable with it, at least in his later writing. So, along with George Antheil's Ballet Mécanique, now there's a cool piece to look up. It uses airplane propellers and sirens and stuff. Antheil, American composer. Ballet Mécanique. This piece is, first of all, an adoration of machines. Machines that work, they do stuff. Relentless progress. This is the 1920s, after all. The world is our oyster. We are progressing. Progress is good. It's almost too good. It's a little too slick and a little scary, perhaps. Machines are organized. They are energetic. They always function. Perhaps they are better than humans. We're flirting with this. Is it yes? How dare we? Ooh, do we say they are? Or not? Are we going to become machines ourselves? Perhaps, perhaps not. Machines, certainly by this time in the arts, we see parodies of machines. In fact, the Surrealists parodied machines. I think I can put up for you an image of Marcel Duchamp's odd, useless machine that is depicted in this work. It's called The Bride Laid Bare for Her Bachelor's Even. This is a sculpture that is a machine that is broken, and the glass in which it is framed is broken by accident, but that's good because it's all broken. It's very Dada, pointless, useless machine. Machines post-war were also put down as the image of the evolution of society, the soulless society that caused the World War. This is where we've come. Industrialization has caused this to happen. Now, one reaction to that could be a sort of nostalgic looking back to the golden age. But in this case, we're going to sort of stare these machines right in the face and say, oh, but maybe they're still pretty cool. Honegger's intent was apparently, as he said, a mathematical depiction of accelerating forces. This machine is depicted with just normal orchestral instruments. It performs its work. It wears itself out. There is no hero quest. There is no pretty train tale. No beautiful formalism of sonata form. It's not about that. It's not atonal, but it's not tonal for any point, any reason. We're not resolving true love here or anything like that. This machine is, in a way, as inhuman and elemental as anything the primitivists did, Rite of Spring, where the inhuman natural forces caused the sacrifice of the Virgin. This machine has its own sacrifice. In fact, you could say it's its own self-sacrifice, because by the end of the piece, the machine wears out and stops. The futility, it doesn't even, it has no no will of its own. It just does its thing, it wears out, and it's done. That's also a thread of this. I kind of get excited about this creepy hopelessness. In this piece, what should you note as style characteristics? Again, relentless ostinato, meant to depict a continually working machine. You got to get the idea of working stuff that works, that does its thing. We have superposed melodic fragments. If you listen, you'll hear da 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 da. In fact, one of the fragments the trumpets play sounds just like Petrushka to me. But we have these melodic fragments that are superposed over a pre-existing texture. So we have polyrhythm, and these fragments don't hook into it at all. They flash across like bursts of steam randomly coming out of parts of the train. They're not related to the working of the whole, yet they are part of that whole. There is dissonance and there is resolution, but the overall effect is not an organic resolution to tonic. It's more a mathematical kind of progression of work. It's a colder, more left-brainy progression of consonance, dissonance, resolution. Consonance, dissonance, resolution. It's a machine. That's about all I have to say about it. I will say just as a side note, because it's one of the things I like to think about, the factory or work music of 1940s and 50s Warner Brother cartoons, dum 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 da da dum 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 da da dum 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 da da dum dum dum, is both tied to clearly to swing, but also has a link to this kind of mécanique music that a few composers are doing. This idea of relentless work music, and it turns into then a sort of cartoon musical underlay of constant work, which I think is kind of cool.